So if you've ever tried to read the Bible from the beginning, you probably started with Genesis. And maybe, like a lot of people, you made it through a few dramatic chapters, some really dramatic chapters. Then things got complicated. Genealogies, strange laws, stories that feel ancient, confusing, sometimes even offensive. And yet, these first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, what we call the Pentateuch and what Jewish people call the Torah, are the foundation of the entire Bible. Again, for Jews, this is the Torah, the sacred center. For Christians, it's the beginning of everything. Today, we're going to explore how Marcus Borg invites us to read the Pentateuch/Torah, again, not literally, but seriously, not as a history textbook or a divine rule book, but as a sacred story, Israel's story, and perhaps our own story. Borg wants us to ask 2 questions as we go. First, why did ancient Israel tell these stories? And second, why did they tell them this way? So let's start in Genesis. Now you might think that Genesis is a book of origins, like where did the world come from? But really, the heart of Genesis begins in chapter 12 when God speaks to a man named Abraham. Go, God says, leave your home, I'll show you a land, and I'll give you descendants and a future. So that promise to Abraham and Sarah sets the stage for the entire story. But the fulfillment of that promise doesn't come easily. Over and over again, the story is threatened. Sarah is barren, Isaac's wife is barren, Rebecca, also barren, Rachel, barren as well. And yet, somehow in each generation, life happens. A child is born. A family grows, a nation begins to form. Borg points out how important this theme is. Israel is saying, quote, yes, there were obstacles, biological, political, even moral, but God is faithful. The promise unfolds not because our ancestors were perfect, but because they were part of something bigger, end quote. And then we get Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers. It doesn't get much darker than that. And yet, years later, Joseph is the one who saves those very same brothers from starvation during a famine. And he says to them, you meant this for evil, but God means it for good. Now that is a deep theological statement, one that many of us, if we're honest, long to believe or have longed to believe, that somehow even in our worst chapters of life might be woven into something redemptive. So from Genesis, we move into Exodus, and here the story really becomes Israel's primal narrative, their spiritual origin story, if you will. It begins with a terrifying sentence, which is, quote, now a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, end quote. And just like that, the descendants of Abraham are enslaved. For the Israelites, Egypt becomes more than a place. It becomes a symbol of oppression, domination, and exploitation. Pharaoh is not a just king. And he's not just a king. He's the archetype of every empire that crushes the vulnerable. And God? Well, God hears the groaning in the Bible. That's what the text says. Quote, God heard their cry, end quote. Now, God calls Moses in the Bible an exile, a stammering fugitive, and says, go to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go. And you know what follows. Plagues, resistance, fear, and finally liberation. The sea parts and the people cross. Now, Borg doesn't ask us to believe that the water literally formed walls. He's not concerned with proving or disproving the miracle. What matters is what the story means. And for Israel, it means this. God is a God who liberates. God hears, God sees, God acts. God is not the God of the empire. God is the one who sides with the oppressed. And this isn't just a memory. It's identity. Every year, still at Passover, Jewish people still say, quote, it wasn't just our ancestors. We were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out, end quote. That's what Borg means when he talks about sacred story. It's not just about the past, it's about who we are now. But the story in Exodus doesn't end at the sea. The Israelites don't go straight to the promised land. Nope. They go to Sinai. And it's there, at the mountain, that they receive the covenant. God says, quote, you saw what I did to the Egyptians. I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. If you keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured people, end quote. It's a moment of identity, of mutual belonging, of sacred relationship. Now, from here, we get a lot of laws, some beautiful, some bewildering, but Borg emphasizes that these laws were not just rules. They were an attempt to create a society shaped by the memory of liberation. So a society shaped by the memory of liberation. Why do you rest on the 7th day? Because you're not slaves anymore. Why do you care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger? Because you were strangers in Egypt. And then come these radical instructions. Every 7th year, forgive debts. Every 50th year, return land. Set people free. These laws were built on the idea that no one should be permanently crushed by poverty or oppression. Borg calls them, quote, some of the most radical socio-economic legislation in human history, end quote, which is pretty amazing. Of course, the people struggle, as all people always struggle. They worship a golden calf, they complain, they wander, but God, again and again, remains faithful in the text. Now, the rest of the story, Numbers and Deuteronomy, is wilderness. Waiting, wandering, learning to be a people, facing their fears, failing, beginning again. Moses never gets to enter the promised land, but from Mount Nebo, he sees it. He looks out across the valley, and he dies there, on the edge of fulfillment. And that's where the Pentateuch ends. That's where the Torah ends. So what do we do with all this? Well, Marcus Borg encourages us to let go of a literal reading and instead to read the Pentateuch/Torah as a sacred story, as memory shaped by meaning. We don't need to believe that God wrote these books by dictation or that Moses was the sole author. What matters is the deep truth they carry, that we are part of a sacred history, that liberation is central to God's identity, that covenant is not about control, but about connection, that the laws are not hoops to jump through, but ways of living out a memory of freedom, and that even when we are in the wilderness, even when the promise feels far, far away, the story isn't over. In the end, Borg's reading of the Pentateuch is both honest and hopeful. It takes seriously the messiness of these ancient texts while also honoring their sacred purpose. Because in these stories, however ancient, however complicated, something holy is still speaking.